Imagine your entire city plunged into darkness, street lamps extinguished, windows covered in heavy curtains. Even a cigarette lit on the corner of a street could spell disaster. It wasn't nature that demanded this blackout, it was war. And in that suffocating darkness, voices called out, guiding, warning, sometimes scolding. They belonged to the men we rarely remember, Britain's ARP Wardens. The blackout was one of the most dramatic changes to everyday life in Britain during the Second World War. It began before the war even started, in September 1939, and it was absolute. At dusk, every town, village and city across the nation went dark. Not a chink of light was allowed to escape from homes, factories or shops. Car headlights were fitted with narrow slits. Street lamps were extinguished. Even the glow of a torch was kept under strict control. Why? Because a single glimmer could give enemy bombers the clue they needed to drop death from the sky. This new reality required guardians, ordinary citizens who would patrol the streets, enforcing the blackout and preparing for raids. They were the Air Raid Precautions Wardens, or ARP Wardens, and by the time the Blitz began in 1940, over 1.4 million men and women had volunteered across Britain. But let us step back to the late 1930s, when the storm clouds of war gathered over Europe. The government, remembering the air raids of the First World War, anticipated that civilian populations would again be targets. The prediction was chilling. Thousands could die in the first weeks of bombing. To prepare, the ARP was formed in 1937. Recruitment posters appeared, asking ordinary Britons to serve their communities, not with rifles, but with whistles, armbands, and gas masks. The call attracted a cross-section of society. Middle-aged men too old for military service, young clerks eager to contribute, retired soldiers, and even women who wanted to do their part. They did not wear uniforms at first, just a steel helmet stamped with the letters ARP and a simple armband. Their weapons were their voices, their torches, and their courage. A warden's nightly duty began with the sunset. As darkness fell, they took to the streets of their neighborhoods. Their role was deceptively simple: ensure that every household was fully blacked out. Curtains had to be thick enough to stop a single ray of light from leaking through. Car owners were ordered to adjust their headlights. Shopkeepers faced fines if their premises glowed after dark. And it was the wardens who enforced these rules. It was not glamorous work. They knocked on doors, reprimanded careless residents, and sometimes earned resentment. Many Britons joked that wardens were busybodies with whistles. They became the butt of jokes in popular culture, portrayed as meddling neighbors who relished authority. Yet beneath the humor lay a reality that was anything but trivial. A single uncovered window could attract enemy bombers. A single careless light could mark the difference between a safe night and a street reduced to rubble. Wardens carried the weight of that responsibility every evening. And when the sirens wailed, when the ominous rising and falling notes of the air raid siren cut through the silence, their role became even more critical. Wardens guided people to shelters, checked on the vulnerable, and made sure streets were cleared. They patrolled through falling bombs, not because they were soldiers, but because they were guardians of order in chaos. Consider for a moment the courage it took to step outside during a raid. Bombs did not discriminate. Wardens were as exposed as anyone else, and yet, while others rushed to safety, wardens moved in the opposite direction, towards danger. Their flashlights pierced the smoke, their voices cut through the fear, and their whistles signaled instructions in the darkness. It was not only the Blitz of London that tested them. Cities like Coventry, Liverpool, Plymouth, and Birmingham all suffered devastating raids. In every case, ARP wardens were there, often the first to arrive at the scene of destruction, long before rescue crews could mobilize. They gave first aid, reported fires, and comforted survivors. Still, their duty began long before the bombs fell. In the months leading up to the Blitz, wardens were tasked with distributing gas masks to the civilian population, ensuring families understood how to use them. They trained in identifying unexploded bombs, learned basic firefighting, and studied how to coordinate with police, ambulance crews, and fire brigades. Their work was both preventive and reactive, an invisible net holding communities together when fear threatened to tear them apart. One warden, interviewed years later, described the strange intimacy of his role. You knew every door, every family. You saw their lives in fragments, curtains drawn, children ushered into shelters, an anxious mother arguing about a sliver of light under the door. We weren't heroes in our own eyes. We were neighbors, making sure neighbors survived. The human side of the blackout should not be overlooked. Imagine the tension of a warden confronting a family who left their light on too long. Was it irritation? Was it fear? Behind the stern voice and the whistle was often a deep sense of care. They understood that one mistake could cost not only the careless family lives, but also the lives of their neighbors. Yet this responsibility carried its own toll. Wardens lived under the same bombs, had families of their own, and bore the same anxieties. Many balanced their duties with day jobs, working in shops, factories, or offices by day, then patrolling darkened streets at night. Sleep was a luxury they rarely enjoyed. Their contribution was not always glamorous, nor was it always recognized. But as the blackout became the nightly rhythm of wartime Britain, ARP wardens became a constant presence. The sound of their footsteps, the flicker of their flashlights, the sharp whistle cutting through the dark, these became the heartbeat of a city determined to endure. By the time the Blitz reached its peak in 1940 and 1941, the British public began to see wardens differently. They were no longer just enforcers of rules. They were men who stood firm when fear gripped the streets. They were the ones who checked on the elderly, soothed crying children, and gave orders that carried the authority of survival. And yet their story has often been overshadowed by the more dramatic images of firefighters battling infernos or soldiers on the front lines. The warden's battlefield was quieter, less visible, but no less vital. Their voices in the blackout were, quite literally, the sound of survival. By the time dusk fell each evening, Britain's cities transformed into something unrecognizable. Streets that once glowed with the warmth of shop windows and the soft orange haze of lamplight now disappeared into a sea of black. The only sound might be footsteps on the pavement, the occasional creak of a door, or the sharp voice of an ARP warden reminding a household to douse that light. For the wardens themselves, this rhythm became routine, though never easy. Their day often began as any civilians. Working in a factory, an office, or a shop, they might spend hours behind a desk, managing shipments or balancing accounts, only to return home, grab a quick meal, and then head out into the night with their steel helmets and armbands. Their shift as wardens was unpaid, voluntary, and exhausting. But once the blackout began, their responsibility could not be ignored. Patrolling meant constant vigilance. A warden might walk the same street dozens of times in a single night, scanning each window for the faintest glow. Curtains had to overlap tightly, and families often used heavy black fabric or even coats to cover any gaps. A careless streak of light from a bedroom lamp could invite reprimand, and fines if the warning was ignored. Some wardens took a stern approach, banging on doors with whistles in hand. Others used a gentler tone, understanding that families were stressed and fearful already. There were frequent confrontations. A tired factory worker who had just finished a 12-hour shift might not take kindly to being told his blackout curtains were insufficient. Teenagers, restless from long evenings indoors, sometimes tested the patience of wardens by sneaking cigarettes in the shadows, their glowing tips tiny beacons visible from far above. A warden's job was not to win popularity, it was to keep people alive. And yet, the image of wardens as meddling neighbors immortalized in jokes, comic strips, and radio programs, was only half the truth. Beneath the stereotype lay countless acts of quiet kindness. A warden helping an elderly widow adjust her curtains rather than issuing a ticket. Another staying late to guide a nervous mother and her children to a shelter. Many residents came to trust the wardens as steady presences in a time when stability was scarce. Life during the blackout was more than inconvenience, it was dangerous. Road accidents skyrocketed as drivers struggled with dimmed headlights and pedestrians stumbled through unlit streets. Wardens often found themselves acting as traffic guides, waving down motorists or escorting families across roads, invisible in the gloom. Some wardens were killed in these very accidents, struck by cars they could not see coming. Their duties extended beyond enforcing darkness. When the sirens began to wail, the wardens' true work began. They were the first to ensure that civilians made their way to shelters, some built in gardens, others in basements, and many in the communal underground stations. Families often hesitated, exhausted by false alarms, but wardens had to insist every warning could be the one that mattered. Once the bombs began to fall, the wardens' courage was tested. Armed only with flashlights, notebooks, and whistles, they walked the deserted streets, searching for fires, collapsed buildings, or those who had failed to reach safety in time. They were the link between frightened families and the emergency services. Wardens carried responsibility for reporting bomb impacts, marking unexploded ordnance, and summoning rescue crews. There are stories preserved in the archives of wardens who risked their lives repeatedly in these moments. One account describes a warden in London guiding a group of children through burning streets, the glow of fires reflecting in his helmet as he shouted encouragement. Another tells of a warden who crawled into the ruins of a house, pulling survivors from the rubble before the fire brigade could arrive. Despite these moments of bravery, wardens rarely thought of themselves as heroes. Many dismissed their work as just doing what needed to be done. In reality, they bore a constant burden of stress. Every night could bring death, destruction, and despair. Wardens often returned home at dawn, exhausted, only to begin another day at their regular jobs. Some admitted that the hardest part was not the danger, but the relentless cycle. Never enough sleep, never enough time to process the horrors they witnessed. And then there was the human weight of loss. A warden might enforce blackout rules at one house one night, only to find it reduced to rubble the next morning. They saw familiar faces vanish, families displaced, and entire streets destroyed. They had to maintain composure, to keep giving orders, to comfort the grieving, all while suppressing their own fear. The psychological toll was immense. Unlike soldiers on the front lines, wardens did not have the release of combat or the camaraderie of a military unit. Their battlefield was the same street they called home. The same families they protected were the ones they bought bread alongside in the morning. This intimacy made their duty both more personal and more painful. Still, small acts of resilience defined their service. Wardens often carried sweets for frightened children, using them to coax little ones into shelters. Some made jokes to lighten the tension, turning the whistle from a symbol of authority into a reassuring sound. Many became community figures, familiar faces who reassured people simply by being present in the darkness. One warden later recalled, "People cursed us for knocking on their doors, scolded us for being strict, but when the bombs came, they listened. They knew we would never ask them to move if it wasn't necessary. We had to earn that trust night after night." The role demanded a peculiar blend of firmness and compassion. Wardens needed authority to maintain order, but also humanity to keep morale alive. They were enforcers, yes, but they were also neighbors, fathers, shopkeepers, and friends. That duality made them uniquely powerful figures in Britain's wartime life. And as the war deepened, their duties expanded even further. Wardens trained in identifying different types of bombs, directing fire services, and even providing emergency first aid. They were not merely peacekeepers of the blackout. They were the first responders of their communities. Each night they patrolled the darkness. Their voices became the thread that stitched together neighborhoods trembling under threat. They were reminders that, even in total blackout, someone was watching over you. The summer of 1940 marked a turning point. The Battle of Britain was raging in the skies, and soon the Blitz would turn the blackout from an inconvenience into a matter of survival. For the ARP Wardens, everything changed once the bombs began to fall night after night. The wail of the sirens was the signal. In homes across Britain, families rushed to their shelters, clutching blankets, gas masks, and whatever possessions they could carry. And in the streets, the Wardens took their posts. Their whistles and flashlights cut through the dark, guiding people towards safety. The once quiet patrols now became frantic, urgent missions. In London, Coventry, Liverpool, and countless other cities, the Wardens became the first line of defense against chaos. They had to ensure the blackout was absolute, but their task extended far beyond extinguishing light. They were the organizers of panic, the managers of fear. During raids, bombs often fell unpredictably, sometimes far from their intended targets, sometimes directly onto residential neighborhoods. When the ground shook and windows shattered, Wardens rushed into the rubble. They did not have heavy equipment or protective gear. Armed with only shovels, crowbars, and sheer determination, they searched for survivors. Many stories survive of their bravery. In September 1940, when London endured its first devastating raids, Wardens in the East End were among the first to respond to collapsing houses. One Warden, remembered only as Mr. Jones in local records, carried 2 children from a burning building before returning to search for their parents. He never came out again. His comrades later found his helmet among the ruins. Elsewhere, in Coventry, where entire streets were reduced to rubble in a single night, Wardens were seen forming human chains to pass buckets of water, trying desperately to extinguish fires while bombs continued to fall. Firefighters could not reach every blaze, so Wardens filled the gap, often at enormous personal risk. What made their courage so remarkable was not just the danger, but the ordinariness of who they were. These were not soldiers trained for war. They were bakers, postmen, tailors, teachers, ordinary men and women who had chosen to shoulder responsibility for their neighbors. And women played a crucial role. Thousands served as wardens, patrolling just as their male counterparts did. They enforced the blackout, guided people to shelters, and took part in rescue work. Many were mothers themselves, balancing domestic responsibilities with night patrols. In a society that often underestimated women's capacity for leadership, the ARP gave them undeniable authority and respect. The Wardens' duties during raids were as psychological as they were physical. Children especially needed reassurance. Imagine being 6 years old, huddled in an Anderson shelter, listening to bombs whistle overhead. A familiar warden's voice at the door, calm and steady, could be the difference between terror and endurance. One child later recalled, "When Mr. Thompson came to check on us, I knew we'd be all right. He sounded so sure, even when the house above us was shaking." But the work was relentless. Night after night, the bombs fell. Wardens rarely had time to recover from one raid before the next began. Sleep became a luxury, measured in minutes. Meals were missed. Many wardens continued to hold full-time jobs by day, pushing themselves to the brink of exhaustion. The strain also tested their relationships. Families of wardens often worried constantly, knowing that their loved ones were out in the streets while bombs rained down. Some marriages crumbled under the pressure, while others grew stronger through shared sacrifice. Despite the hardships, there were moments of resilience that spoke to the British spirit. Wardens often became the anchors of community morale. They cracked jokes in shelters, organized sing-alongs to drown out the drone of enemy planes, and shared their rations with those who had lost everything. Perhaps the greatest symbol of their role came in the aftermath of raids. At dawn, When people emerged to survey the wreckage, it was often the wardens who were already there, marking dangerous craters with chalk, warning children away from unexploded bombs, and helping neighbors salvage what they could. Their presence gave continuity to life amid destruction. And though their authority was sometimes resented in the early days of the Blackout, the Blitz transformed public opinion. By 1941, many people regarded wardens as community heroes, as essential as the firefighters and ambulance crews. They were no longer just the figures who shouted about curtains and lamps. They were the people who pulled survivors from rubble, who stood guard in the darkest hours, who never abandoned their posts. One warden summarized it best in his diary. "Our job is not glamorous. We do not fight with rifles or fly planes, but we fight in our way. We fight with whistles, with words, with steady hands. And if we fall, at least we fall knowing we kept the light from shining and kept our neighbors alive." This quiet, steadfast service became the heartbeat of Britain's home front defense. By 1942, Britain had endured the worst nights of the Blitz. London, Coventry, Birmingham, Liverpool, all had been scarred by fire and rubble. And yet, the nation endured. For the ARP wardens, the struggle was not over, but their role began to evolve as the war stretched on. The nightly raids became less constant, though never absent. Instead, new challenges emerged. The threat of gas attacks, though never realized, required constant vigilance. Wardens trained civilians in how to use gas masks, distributed new equipment, and reminded people to keep their masks nearby. Drills were held in schools, workplaces, and even cinemas. Children learned to sing songs about their masks, an attempt to turn fear into familiarity. By this time, the wardens had also grown more professional. The chaos of 1939 had given way to a system refined by years of experience. Each neighborhood post had routines, checking blackout curtains before nightfall, organizing ward patrols, maintaining shelter records. Younger recruits joined, learning from the older hands who had already seen the worst. Many of the seasoned wardens carried a quiet authority, their calm presence earned through nights spent under falling bombs. The work was not without its tensions. Civilians, weary of restrictions, sometimes clashed with the wardens. Complaints about curfews, about fines for light leaks, about being told to take shelter, these were common. But wardens persisted, knowing that complacency could be deadly. In industrial cities where factories worked around the clock, the blackout remained especially vital. A single uncovered window could reveal the location of a plant producing weapons or aircraft. The wardens' influence extended beyond the streets. They became community leaders, mediators, and symbols of resilience. When ration shortages hit, it was often the wardens who organized communal meals in shelters. When morale flagged, they encouraged neighbors to support one another. Many kept detailed diaries, which today serve as invaluable records of life on the home front. These writings capture the blend of exhaustion, pride, and sorrow that defined their work. Bombing raids were less frequent, but the responsibility for preparedness remained. In these quieter settings, the wardens sometimes felt forgotten, their sacrifices overshadowed by the drama of the big cities. Yet their commitment was the same. An invisible shield stretched across every corner of Britain. The danger, too, remained real. Even in 1944, with the war seemingly turning in the Allies' favor, the wardens faced new threats in the form of V-1 flying bombs, the so-called doodlebugs. These pilotless weapons brought sudden, devastating explosions to London and the southeast. Once again, wardens were there, directing survivors, organizing rescues, calming terrified children. For them, the war never lost its urgency. The ARP did not recruit superheroes. It relied on bakers, clerks, teachers, and pensioners. Their uniforms were simple: a steel helmet with W painted on the front, an armband, a whistle, and sometimes a gas mask. But in their communities, these small symbols carried immense weight. The authority of the Wardens was never absolute, but it was deeply personal. They were not distant officials, they were neighbors, or who carried your child to safety in the middle of the night. Cities emerged blinking into the light after years of enforced darkness. For many, the sight of street lamps burning again was as symbolic as any military victory. The adrenaline of constant vigilance had defined their lives for years. Returning to ordinary routines was not always easy. Yet the legacy of the ARP Wardens endured. In post-war Britain, many communities remembered them as the silent guardians of the home front. Streets where they had patrolled erected plaques in their honor. Diaries and memoirs were published, giving voice to those who had once been invisible. By maintaining order, by reassuring the frightened, by insisting on discipline in the face of chaos, they had helped hold the nation together. One historian later remarked, "The ARP Wardens embodied the essence of civilian courage." Their voices may not have carried across the battlefield, but in the silent streets of Blackout Britain, they were the voices that kept fear at bay. When the war ended in 1945, Britain erupted in celebration. Crowds filled the streets, bells rang from churches, and lights once again illuminated cities that had lived for years in darkness. For many, it was the first time in nearly 6 years they could walk at night without fear of a siren. The blackouts were lifted, and families could finally see their neighborhoods fully again, though often scarred by rubble, bomb sites, and empty spaces where houses once stood. And what of the Wardens? For most, it meant a quiet return to normal life. They set aside their steel helmets, folded away their armbands, and became once more the bakers, teachers, clerks, and pensioners they had been before. There were no parades in their honor, no medals pinned on their chests in great ceremonies. Their work had been essential, yet invisible. Theirs was not a victory of conquest, but of endurance. Yet in many communities, neighbors remembered. People who had survived the Blitz could recall the reassuring presence of a familiar voice in the night, the whistle that cut through fear, the steady hand that led them to safety. Children grew up remembering the Wardens as protectors, figures who seemed larger than life despite their simple uniforms. In the years that followed, Britain rebuilt. Bomb sites became playgrounds, then homes, then office blocks. The memory of the ARP Wardens sometimes faded into the background, overshadowed by the stories of fighter pilots, generals, and great political leaders. But historians, memoirists, and local councils worked to keep their memory alive. Plaques were erected on buildings they had once patrolled. Museums displayed their helmets, whistles, and diaries. And those diaries, often written in hurried, weary handwriting, revealed the true heart of their service. One entry from a warden in Liverpool read, "Another raid tonight. Helped dig out a family on Ash Street. Lost count of how many hours we've been awake. Still, no one complained. Everyone just did what had to be done." Another from London noted simply, "All clear at 4 a.m. We survived again." These words were not dramatic, but they spoke volumes. They captured the quiet heroism of men and women who did not seek glory, but simply answered a call. The legacy of the ARP Wardens also endures in another way, in the way we think about civilian courage. Wars are often told through the stories of battles and leaders, but the Wardens remind us that resilience on the home front is just as vital. They showed that heroism is not always dramatic. Sometimes it is standing firm in the dark, night after night, for the sake of others. Their example resonates beyond the Second World War. In times of crisis, whether natural disasters, blackouts or emergencies, it is often ordinary people who step forward, organizing neighbors, keeping order and providing reassurance. The spirit of the Wardens lives on in community volunteers, first responders, and anyone who chooses to put the welfare of others above their own comfort. For Britain, the Wardens symbolized the heart of the civilian war effort. They represented the belief that even without weapons, ordinary men and women could play a decisive role in national survival. And they proved that discipline, compassion, and perseverance could be just as powerful as guns or bombs. One former warden, reflecting years later, said, "We were never soldiers, and thank God for it. But we did fight a battle in our own way. We fought against fear, against chaos, against despair, and we won, not with bullets, but with torches, whistles, and the strength to keep going." As the decades have passed, their story has been rediscovered. Documentaries, oral histories, and local projects have given voice to those who once patrolled the Blackout streets. Younger generations, hearing their stories, often express amazement at how much responsibility rested on such ordinary shoulders. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson of all, that history is not only shaped by those who command armies, but by those who keep watch in silence, ensuring their neighbors survive the night. So the next time we imagine Britain during the Blitz, the searchlights sweeping the sky, the sound of planes overhead, the glow of fires in the distance, we should also imagine the figure in the steel helmet, standing at a corner, flashlight in hand, voice steady, telling frightened families, "This way, keep moving, you'll be safe here." They may not have monuments as grand as generals, but they have something deeper. The gratitude of those they saved, the memory of communities held together, and a place in the story of resilience that defines Britain's wartime spirit. The ARP Wardens were, and remain, the quiet voices in the Blackout. Ordinary heroes whose courage lit the path through the darkest nights.